The cuts are pure compression, redundant phrasing, doubled descriptions, and filler clauses, spread across the setup, incident, and escalation. Estimated length is ~5,000 words, inside your 4,805,200 window. A hand shoved hard into a young woman's shoulder. She stumbled backward and a tray of dishes crashed to the floor. Broken glass scattered across the tile. She threw both arms up to cover her face and waited for the next hit. A man in an expensive gray suit stood over her, laughing. He raised his hand again. Around them, a whole diner went silent. Forks stopped moving. Nobody breathed. Nobody stood up. Nobody except one old man in the corner booth who slowly set down his coffee cup. Beside him, a gray-muzzled dog rose to its feet. The old man's name was Elias Ward, and for 20 years he had trained himself to never lose control. Now he stood up. What did a retired Navy man do in the next 90 seconds that left every single person in that room frozen in silence? Stay with me on this one. Let me back up a little because you need to understand who these people were before that first plate ever hit the floor. The town was Millbrook, Georgia. One main street, a white church, a hardware store, and a diner called the Copper Kettle that had poured the same coffee for 40 years. Everybody knew everybody. And everybody knew Dorsey Vance. Vance owned half the town, or he was working on it. Real estate. He'd buy land cheap, push the old families out, and throw up strip malls where farms used to be. He wore $300 suits in a town where most men wore work boots, drove a black car that cost more than some of the houses on the street, and he talked to people like they were in his way. Now here's the thing about a man like that. In a small town, nobody stops him. The sheriff played golf with him. The bank did business with him. So Vance had spent years learning one simple lesson. He could do whatever he wanted, and nobody would say a word. Then there was the old man in the corner booth. Elias Ward, 71 years old, gray hair cut short. He came into the Copper Kettle every morning at 7. Same booth, same order. 2 eggs, wheat toast, black coffee. He never said much. He'd nod at the regulars, leave a good tip, and walk out with that old dog trailing behind him. Most folks in Millbrook figured he was just a quiet retiree, a widower who kept to himself. They saw a slow-moving old man with a limp and a graying dog, and they didn't think twice. What they didn't know was what Elias Ward used to be. Master Chief, Navy SEAL, 26 years in the teams. He'd been to places most people can't find on a map and done things there he never talked about. Not to his late wife, not to anybody. He'd buried all of it deep and spent the last 20 years learning how to keep it buried. Because a man who's done what Elias did learns that the hardest thing in the world isn't fighting. It's not fighting. Sitting still when everything in you is screaming to move. The dog's name was Ranger. A German shepherd, gray around the muzzle, slow in the hips. He'd served 2, sniffing out explosives on 2 deployments before a blast took part of his hearing and ended his career the same year Elias hung his up. They'd retired together. 2 old soldiers who understood each other in a way that didn't need words. And then there was the girl. Her name was Maddie, 23 years old, and it was her very first shift. You could see it on her. Her hands shook when she carried the coffee pot. She kept checking a little notepad, reading her own handwriting twice. She wore a borrowed apron a size too big. She'd come to Millbrook 3 weeks earlier with 1 suitcase and no plan, and this job was the only thing between her and the street. She didn't know Elias, and Elias didn't know her. Not yet. But something about her made the old man look up from his coffee and watch her longer than usual, the shape of her face, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. It tugged at something in the back of his mind, and he couldn't say why. He'd find out why soon enough. Believe me, when he did, it knocked the wind clean out of him. But first, the trouble walked in. Vance came through the door at 8:15 with 2 men behind him. Hangers-on, the kind who laugh at everything the boss says. He snapped his fingers at the nearest table like he was calling a dog and sat down without waiting. The whole diner seemed to shrink. Conversations got quieter. People stared into their plates. Maddie didn't know any better. She walked right over with her shaking hands and gave him a nervous little smile, and she took his order. That was the moment everything started to go wrong. Coffee black, steak and eggs, steak medium rare, hash browns, not home fries, a side of biscuits. She read it back to him, careful, the way you're taught on your first day. Vance didn't even look at her. He waved her off like she was a fly. In the kitchen, the cook was slammed. Morning rush, one cook, one new waitress, 40 hungry people. Maddie ran plates for 20 minutes straight, and somewhere in the chaos, the order got crossed. She came back and set down steak and eggs, all right. But the steak was well done, gray all the way through. And it was home fries, not hash browns. Now a normal man says, "Hey, this isn't what I ordered." Sends it back. Simple. Dorsey Vance was not a normal man. He picked up the plate, looked at it, and let it drop back onto the table with a bang that made half the room jump. "What is this?" he said, not loud, quiet. That quiet is worse. "Did I ask for this, did I?" Maddie went pale. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me fix that right away. I'll get you a new one on the house." "On the house?" He laughed, and his two friends laughed with him. "You hear that? Like she's doing me a favor." He stood up. He was a big man, taller than her by a foot, and he stepped in close so she had to tilt her head back to look at him. "You know who I am?" "No, sir." "No, sir," he mimicked in a high little voice. The friends laughed again. That's the problem with this town. Nobody knows their place anymore. And over in the corner booth, an old man set down his fork very, very slowly and turned his head. Maddie backed up a step, holding her order pad against her chest like a shield. "I'll get the manager," she said. "I'll make it right, I promise." "You already ruined my morning." And then, for no reason except that he could, he shoved her, hard, both hands into her shoulders. She flew backward, her hip caught the edge of the next table, and the tray she'd left there tipped. Down came a whole stack of clean plates, crashing across the tile, glass everywhere. She hit the floor on her tailbone and threw her arms up over her face, because in her short life she'd learned that when a man that size comes at you, you protect your head. That's where we came in. The diner went dead silent. 40 people and not one moved. The cook stood frozen in the kitchen window. Vance's two friends laughed, but their laughter died out fast because something in the room had changed and they couldn't name it. Vance stood over the girl and raised his hand again. "Get up. Clean this up. Now."
Yes.
And the old man in the corner stood up. He didn't rush. That was the strange part, the part everybody who was there still talks about. He just rose out of his booth, slow and steady, and the gray dog rose with him. Elias touched the dog's head once. "Stay." Ranger sat. And Elias walked across that floor, past the frozen customers, past the broken plates, and stopped a few feet from Vance. "Son," he said, his voice was calm, almost gentle, "I think you owe that young lady an apology." Vance turned and looked at him and saw exactly what everybody else saw. A gray-haired old man in a flannel shirt, slight limp, cheap boots. Nobody. He looked Elias up and down and grinned. "Sit down, Grandpa," he said, "before you hurt yourself." Elias didn't move. He glanced down at Maddie, still shielding her face, and something crossed his eyes for a second. Then it was gone, locked back down where he kept it. "I'm not going to ask you again," he said. "Help her up. Say you're sorry, and this ends right here. That's the whole thing." For 1 second, it looked like it might actually work. Vance blinked. The room held its breath. Maybe the old man's calm reached him somehow. Then Vance laughed again, louder, and turned back to Maddie. "Or what?" he said, and reached down for her arm to drag her up. "You gonna do something, old man?" He never got to finish the thought. Now I want you to slow down with me here because what happened next happened fast, and if you blink you'll miss how it worked. Elias didn't throw a punch. He didn't yell. He caught Vance's wrist in midair and just held it. That's all it looked like from across the room. Two men, the old one holding the young one's wrist, but Vance's whole face changed. The grin dropped off it. His knees started to buckle. Because Elias had that wrist locked in a way that sent a bolt of pain straight up into the shoulder. A control hold. The kind they teach you when you need to move a man twice your size without hurting him worse than you have to. Vance made a sound like a kettle, a high, thin whine. "Easy," Elias said quietly so only Vance could hear. "Nothing's broken, but you're going to listen to me now." He guided Vance back, one careful step, then another, and eased him down into the booth like you'd sit an old man. Vance's two friends jumped up, one reaching inside his jacket, and that's when the gray dog came off the floor with a bark that cracked through the diner like a rifle shot. Ranger didn't lunge. He just stood between Elias and the two men, ears back, teeth showing, and every instinct told those two not to take one more step. They didn't. Elias let go of the wrist. Vance grabbed it with his other hand and cradled it against his chest, breathing hard, staring up at the old man like he'd seen a ghost. "You broke my hand," he gasped, though nothing was broken and he knew it. "I didn't break anything," Elias said. He turned away, crouched down next to Maddie, slow, his bad knee popping, and held out one weathered hand. "You okay, sweetheart? You hurt?" And Maddie lowered her arms and looked up at him. And that's when the old man got the wind knocked out of him. Because up close, kneeling on the floor of a diner in a town he'd picked at random off a map 3 years ago, he was looking at a face he knew. A face he'd carried in his memory for 20 years. He couldn't speak. He just stared. He helped her to her feet. The whole room let out its breath at once. It was over. The bully was sitting down nursing his wrist. The old man had won. Somebody started to clap and a couple more joined in. Elias walked Maddie to his corner booth, sat her down, poured her a glass of water and told her to breathe. Ranger put his gray head in her lap and she stroked his ears with a trembling hand. The cook came out of the kitchen. Somebody handed Maddie a napkin for her eyes. It was quiet now, the good kind of quiet. The kind that feels like the end of the storm. Elias sat down across from her. He picked up his coffee cup, the same one he'd set down 5 minutes ago, and took a sip. His hand was steady. Everything in him had gone still. He looked at this frightened girl drinking his water and petting his dog, and for the first time in 20 years, something in the old man felt almost at peace. He'd done a small good thing. That was going to be the whole story. It wasn't. Because Vance, over in his booth, had pulled out his phone. He was talking into it low and fast, and his voice had stopped shaking. It had gone cold. "Yeah," he was saying. "Copper kettle right now and bring Carl." He hung up, looked across the diner at the old man and the girl, and smiled. And that smile told you everything. This wasn't about a steak anymore. It wasn't even about pride. This was a man who owned a town, had just been humiliated in front of it, and had no intention of letting anybody walk out that door. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, old man," Vance said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You have no idea who you just put your hands on." Elias set down his coffee, and here's the thing. Maddie saw his face and she said later it didn't change at all. He just looked tired. Like a man who'd hoped, for once, that things could stay simple and had just been told they wouldn't. "No, son," Elias said. "I don't believe you know who you just put your hands on." 12 minutes later, 3 trucks pulled up outside the Copper Kettle, and this stopped being a story about a rude customer. Because Vance hadn't called the police. He'd called his people. And Carl, the man he wanted brought along, was the county building inspector. His cousin. The same man who could shut down any business in Millbrook with a single signature. And if you're still with me at this point, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button, because these are exactly the stories the algorithm likes to bury, and you and I both want to see how this old man walks out of it. It only takes a second. All right. Back to the diner. 4 men came through the door. Vance's 2 friends were already there, so that made 6. Big men, most of them, the kind Vance kept around for exactly this. Behind them, in a short-sleeved county shirt with a clipboard, came Cousin Carl. Vance stood up, cradling his wrist for show, and pointed across the room. "That's him. That old lunatic assaulted me, broke my hand in front of 40 witnesses." He looked around the diner, and here's the ugly part. He looked at those 40 people and he said, "Isn't that right? You all saw him attack me, didn't you?" And the room went quiet in a different way now, a shameful way, because these were people who owed Vance money, people whose businesses sat on land he controlled. A few looked down at their plates. Nobody said a word to back the old man up. Nobody said, "No, we saw you shove that girl." They just looked away and let it hang there. Elias watched all of it. He wasn't surprised. A man learns over a long life exactly how far most people will go for a stranger, usually not very far. Carl cleared his throat and started in about the diner, health code, broken glass on the floor. He'd have to write it up. Might have to close the place a few days pending inspection. He said it right to the owner, old Doris, who'd run the copper kettle for 30 years, and her face just crumpled because a few days closed in that season would ruin her. That was the play. Hurt the diner. Make it Elias' fault. Turn the whole room against him so he'd be standing there alone. And it was working. You could feel it working. People started muttering. Why'd the old man have to get involved? Now Doris is going to lose the diner. Should have minded his own business. Maddie stood up, her face red, and she said, "That's not fair. He didn't do anything. That man shoved me. I have a bruise, look." And Vance cut her off cold. "Nobody's talking to you, honey. In fact," he turned to Doris, "she started all of this. Got my order wrong," mouthed off. This old fool jumped in. "If it were me, I'd fire her before the health department even gets here. First shift, and look what she caused." And there it was, the new shape of the thing. It wasn't a fist fight anymore. It was a machine. A quiet, small-town machine that could take an old man's piece, a girl's only job, and an old woman's life's work, and grind them all up without throwing a single punch. Vance didn't need muscle now. He had the county. He had the fear in the room. He had everybody looking the other way. Elias stood up, and the strangest thing happened. All that calm he'd held for 20 years didn't crack. It settled deeper. He walked out to the middle of the floor, into the broken glass, into the center of all those frightened faces, and stood there with his hands loose at his sides. "Doris," he said without turning around, "you're not losing this diner. Not today, not over this. I give you my word." Then he looked at Carl. "You want to write something up, write this. There's a man in this room who put his hands on a young woman half his size twice today in front of 40 witnesses. That's assault. That's a crime in the state of Georgia. And you're going to threaten to close down a widow's diner to cover for him." He let that sit. "I've met a lot of bad men, son, and the dangerous ones were never the loud ones. It was the quiet ones with a clipboard, the ones who did the paperwork." Carl's face went pale and his clipboard dropped a couple of inches. Vance laughed, but it was thinner now. "Big words, old man, from a nobody. You think a speech scares anybody in here? You're one man." He nodded at his crew. "And there's 6 of us. So how about you sit back down before this gets ugly?" "It's already ugly," Elias said. "You made it ugly the second you touched that girl." And then he did something that changed the whole room. He unbuttoned the cuff of his flannel shirt and rolled up his left sleeve. On the inside of his forearm, faded blue with the years, was a tattoo. An anchor, a trident, an eagle, the Budweiser they call it, the Navy SEAL insignia. There were men in that diner, older fellows who knew exactly what it was, and you heard it move through the room like a wave, a whisper. He's a SEAL. That old man's a SEAL. 26 years, Elias said quietly. Master Chief, United States Navy. 2 silver stars I never talk about. I've buried more good men than you've ever met, son, and I promised every one of them I'd never let a bully win in front of me again as long as I could still stand up. He looked at Vance, and for the first time there was something behind his eyes that made the big man take a step back. So here's how this ends. You're going to apologize to that girl. You're going to tell Doris the diner's fine, and you and your 6 men are going to walk out that door. Or what, Vance said, but it came out small. Or I stop being polite, Elias said, and you do not want to see what that looks like. None of you do. One of Vance's men, the biggest of the bunch, decided to test it. He came across the floor fast, swinging a big looping right hand at the old man's head. And everybody in that room expected to watch an old man get hit. That's not what they watched. Elias moved maybe 6 inches, that's all. He slipped under the punch, caught the man's arm as it went past, used his own momentum, and put him face down on the floor so hard the whole diner shook. It took about 1 second. The big man didn't get up. He just lay there groaning, one arm pinned behind him under the old man's knee, and Elias hadn't even changed his breathing. He looked up at the rest of them, still calm. Anybody else feel like earning that, he said, or are we done? Nobody moved. The gray dog stood by the corner booth, teeth showing, and the message from both of them was the same. We do this all day, it's Tuesday for us. And that's when Maddie started to cry, not from fear, from something else. Because she'd been staring at that tattoo, at that anchor and trident, and she was reaching into the neck of her own shirt and pulling out a thin chain. On the end of it was a set of dog tags, old ones, worn smooth. She'd worn them her whole life and never taken them off, because they were the only thing she had left of a father she never got to meet. She held them up in her shaking hand and read the name out loud, the name she'd whispered to herself 1,000 nights growing up. Ryder, she said, Thomas Ryder. Elias went absolutely still. He let go of the man on the floor, stood up slow, turned all the way around and looked at that girl and those tags swinging from her fist, and the color drained right out of his face. Where, he said, and his voice cracked for the first time, an old man's voice breaking clean in half. Where did you get those? They're my father's, Maddie said, crying openly now. He died before I was born, overseas. My mom said he was a Navy man. She said he died saving another man's life, that he pushed his friend out of the way and she couldn't finish it. And the old man's knees went. He caught himself on a table because he knew that name. Lord, he knew it. Tom Ryder had been 24 years old, the best young man Elias ever trained. And on a night 23 years ago in a place with no name on any map, Tom Ryder had seen the grenade before anybody else did, shoved his Master Chief clear and taken it himself. He died in Elias' arms in the dust, and with his last breath he'd grabbed Elias by the collar and made him promise, "Find her, my girl, she's coming in the spring, take care of my girl." Elias had come home and looked, for years. But the mother had moved, changed towns, changed her name after a bad marriage, and the trail went cold. And eventually a broken old man gave up and moved to a random town in Georgia to be quiet and wait to die. He never knew her name was Maddie. He never knew she'd end up in the same town, waiting tables at the same diner where he ate his eggs every morning. He looked at her now, this frightened girl he'd stood up for without knowing why, this girl whose face had tugged at him across the room, and he understood. She had her father's eyes. That's what he'd been seeing all along. "Your daddy," Elias said, and the tears were running down the old man's face now and he didn't wipe them. Your daddy saved my life. I'm the man he pushed out of the way. I'm the one he died for." He put his rough old hand over his mouth. "I've been looking for you for 20 years, sweetheart. 20 years. I made him a promise." The whole diner was silent. 40 people, every one of them crying now, even the tough ones, even old Doris behind the counter with her hand over her heart. Because you don't see something like that. You don't see a promise kept across 20 years and 1,000 miles, keeping itself, in a diner in Millbrook, Georgia, on a random Tuesday morning. And Dorsey Vance and his men just stood there, forgotten, small, in the middle of the biggest thing they'd ever be in the same room as, and not one part of it belonged to them. Here's how it ended. And I'll be quick, because the loud part's over now and this is the part that matters. The sheriff did finally show up, and it turned out even a small-town sheriff has a limit, especially when 40 witnesses suddenly, all at once, find their voices. Because that's what happened. Once they saw the old man cry, once they saw what he really was, the shame lifted off that room, and one after another people started to talk. The trucker in the back said, "I saw Vance shove that girl twice." Doris said, "He threatened my business right in front of everybody." Even Cousin Carl, God help him, looked at his clipboard and then set it down on the counter and said, "Quiet, I'm not writing anything up." And he walked out, and he never did another favor for Dorsey Vance again. Vance got arrested that morning. Simple assault, 2 counts. It didn't put him away long, but something more important happened. The spell broke. A town that had been afraid of one man for years watched that man get put down by an old widower and a gray dog, and they stopped being afraid. Within a year, the deals dried up. People stopped selling to him. The bank got nervous. Dorsey Vance packed up and left Millbrook, and nobody missed him, and the strip mall he'd planned never got built. There's a park there now. Kids play in it. But that's not the part of the story people in Millbrook still tell. The part they tell is what happened after at the corner booth, when the sheriff was gone and the coffee had gone cold. Elias Ward sat down across from Matty Ryder, and he took those dog tags in his rough old hands, gentle, like they might break, and he read her father's name over and over. And he told her everything her mother never could. What kind of man Tom Ryder was, how he laughed, how he was scared of thunderstorms of all things, a Navy SEAL terrified of thunder. How on his last night he talked about nothing but the daughter coming in the spring, the little girl he'd never get to hold. Maddie heard her father's voice for the first time in her life, secondhand, through a crying old man in a flannel shirt, and she said later it was the greatest gift anybody ever gave her. Elias made her a promise that morning too, same one he'd made her father. He said, "You're not alone anymore. Not while I'm breathing." And he kept it. He paid off her back rent that week without being asked. He put her through the community college 2 towns over. When she got married 3 years later in that little white church down the main street, there was no father to walk her down the aisle, so an old man in his only suit did it instead, slow, with a limp, with a gray dog in a bow tie sitting up front in the pew where family sits. And when the preacher asked who gives this woman, Elias Ward's voice didn't crack that time. He'd waited 20 years for it. He said, "Her father does, and I stand in for him." Ranger the dog passed a year later, peaceful in his sleep on the porch. Elias buried him under the oak tree in Maddie's backyard, and he cried like a boy, and Maddie held him the way he'd held her that first morning in the diner. Elias lived long enough to hold his best friend's grandson, a little boy. They named him Thomas, and on the day Elias himself finally passed, an old man in a quiet room, Maddie was holding his hand, and the last thing he said, they say, was he was smiling and he said a name. Just Tom, like he was reporting in, like he was telling an old friend across all those years, mission complete. I found her. I kept her safe. It's done. So the next time you see some quiet old man in the corner of a diner, slow-moving, gray, nobody special, eating his eggs alone, You remember this. You have no idea what he carried, or who he lost, or what promise he's still keeping. The loudest man in the room is almost never the strongest one. And a small kindness, a hand held out to a stranger on the floor, can turn out to be a debt 20 years in the paying, finally, quietly, coming home.